Assalamu alaikum dear students, and welcome to the studio of Allma Iqbal Open University. I'm your instructor Somia Sohail, and we'll be discussing Unit 5 of your book Compulsory English 2 with the code 1424-5411-9408 for BA BS. Unit 5 is about comparison and contrast. Dear students, keep in mind that we have been talking about academic writing so far. In the first unit, we introduced to you what academic writing is. And in various units that followed, we have already seen what are the different processes and structures that go into the making of academic writing. We have talked about the organization and structure of a paragraph. When we talk about comparison and contrast, it may be in a paragraph or it may be in an essay or any longer piece of writing. What we need to see is how is it that we do the type of writing that involves comparison and contrast. As the very name suggests, comparison comes in when we talk about the similarities of two or more phenomena or items or things or persons. There is something very interesting that you must notice, that while we talk about comparison, it is not always about similarities. It may be or it can be about similarities and differences. A comparison paragraph or a comparison question may deal with similarities only or may in the process discuss some of the differences between the ideas, between the objects or the items. But interestingly, when we talk about contrast, we only talk about the dissimilarities and the differences. So, in a comparison and contrast paragraph or an essay or any piece of writing that is dealing with comparison and contrast, you have to see that the items that you're comparing and contrasting are the ones that have certain similarities and differences. As I always say, that before writing, you should be well prepared with all the content, with all the material in your mind and the things that you have to write on. So, you must be well informed about the similarities and differences among things or between things while you are ready to write based on comparison and contrast. I'll repeat for you that comparison is when there are similarities and there may be certain differences, and contrast is only dealing with the differences or the dissimilarities between things or items or objects. To take you back to the transitional expressions that we have already talked about so many times in other units. Dear students, keep in mind that for comparison and contrast, you will be using some transitional expressions in the paragraph or in the piece of writing that you're working on. To remind you what a transitional expression is, I must tell you that transitional expressions are the words and phrases that connect the ideas that you are presenting to your readers. These transitions, they work as bridges that lead you, or lead the readers rather, with your line of thought. So, in a comparison and contrast paragraph, there are various transitional expressions that are used all along. At the end of today's lesson, we'll be talking about some of those transitional expressions. Before this, I'll talk about the technique that you need to look on, the technique that you need to keep in mind while you're doing comparison and contrast writing in English, for academic purposes mostly. Dear students, there are two types of comparison and contrast writing. Sometimes you compare and contrast by point method. Now, when I say point by point method, it is when you have certain points of comparison about the objects being compared in your mind. and you compare the two objects based on those points of comparison. So what are you doing? You're going back and forth between the two objects. You're mentioning them again and again based on the terms of comparison. The other method or the other technique that you can use to write a comparison and contrast paragraph or any piece of writing is called block style of writing. In block style of writing, you describe one object first and then you go on to describe the other object. You talk about the qualities or characteristics of one object in the discussion, and then you write a whole paragraph or whole space of writing you dedicate to the other thing that is being compared or contrasted. While in point-by-point method, you keep the two before each other, in front of each other, and you try to look at the similarities and differences of the two objects that are under comparison. On the screen, you can look at the small block that is there, and it further defines the two techniques of comparison and contrast writing for academic purposes. In point-by-point structure, you can see that the point of comparison, student body, curriculum, and location for college A and college B are being discussed. If you look at the screen, you see that here the two objects that are being compared are college A and college B. You can compare college A and college B in two ways, either by point structure or by using block structure. In using point structure, you will see that there are 3 points of comparison between the two colleges. You compare the student body of college A and college B. You compare curriculum of college A and college B. You compare location of college A and college B. So you are going back and forth from college A to college B, discussing the 3 points of comparison. In block structure, what you have done is that you have written or described college A. What are the things that you have described about college A? Student body, curriculum, and location. And same 3 things or same 3 characteristics of college B are discussed later. So in block structure, you discuss one thing and then you move on to discuss another. So you are not moving back and forth between the 2 items. You are rather using both of them side by side. You just write or describe one and then you move on to the other. In order for you to understand this technique in a better manner, I have certain examples for you. But first, just keep in mind that if you're writing in point structure, you need to have some point of comparison. Now, those points of comparison include the similarities and differences. If you're writing about how the 2 colleges can be compared, college A and college B, there may be some similarities in the student body or some differences. There may be some similarities in curriculum or differences. There may be some similarities in location and or some differences in location. There may be many more things that you can discuss and that you can look at while you're comparing the 2 colleges. I'll first of all give you 2 different examples of point structure. On your screen, you can see the paragraph. Wilson brought qualities as unusual as those of Theodore Roosevelt to American politics. The 2 men had much in common: cultivation, knowledge, literary skill, personal magnetism, relentless drive. But where Roosevelt was unbuttoned and expansive, Wilson was reserved and cool. No one known to history ever called him Woody or WW. Both were lay preachers, but where Roosevelt was a revivalist, bullying his listeners to hit the sawdust trail, Wilson had the severe eloquence of a Calvinist divine. Roosevelt's egotism overflowed his personality. Wilson's was a hard concentrate within. Roosevelt's power lay in what he did, Wilson's in what he held in reserve. Now, looking at the passage in detail or closely, you see that the writer has used point-by-point structure in comparing two former American presidents, Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt. He tells you in the beginning about the commonalities or the similarities in the two presidents: cultivation, knowledge, literary skill, personal magnetism, relentless drive. But then, as soon as he goes on to describe the differences, he uses the word but as a transitional expression. The very use of the word but tells you that he is going to talk about the contrast. Again, when he has to use the similarities, he says both were lay preachers. Now, the use of the word both puts them in the same category and speaks about the similarity between the two. But where Roosevelt was a revivalist, Wilson had the severe eloquence of a Calvinist divine. Again, the use of the word but as transitional expression tells you that now the contrast is coming in. I have another paragraph for you that talks about the structure where the writer talks about point by point, where he uses point by point structure. We have already talked about the fact that when we use point by point structure, the writer moves back and forth to the items of comparison. Here in the coming paragraph, the writer is comparing two brothers of the same parents. There are certain things that are similar between the two, but then there are others that are very different. My husband and I constantly marvel at the fact that our two sons, born of the same parents and only 2 years apart in age, are such completely different human beings. The most obvious differences became apparent at their births. Our firstborn, Mark, was big and bold. His intense, already wise eyes, broad shoulders, huge and heavy hands, and powerful, chunky legs gave us the impression he could have walked out of the delivery room on his own. Our second son, Wayne, was delightfully different. Rather than having the football physique that Mark was born with, Wayne came into the world with a long, slim, wiry body more suited to running, jumping, and contorting. Wayne's eyes, rather than being intense like Mark's, were impish and innocent. When Mark was delivered, he cried only momentarily and then seemed to settle into a state of intense concentration, as if trying to absorb everything he could about the strange new environment he found himself in. Conversely, Wayne screamed from the moment he first appeared. There was nothing helpless or pathetic about his cry either. He was darn angry. So, if you look at the paragraph, you will see the writer goes back and forth to Mark and Wayne. The writer has already highlighted Mark and Wayne for you to see how many times the writer moves between the two. There are certain points of comparison that the writer has discussed. The moment they were born, the type of bodies they had, the type of look they had, and the very moment they entered into this world. Now, these points of comparison have been touched upon with Mark and Wayne put side by side. Dear students, this is how point by point structure works. The two items of comparison, the two objects of comparison are put side by side. They are put in front of each other, and it is there that the writer tries to look at some of the similarities or differences, or similarities and or differences between the two objects. And he tries to highlight them with the use of transitional expressions. In this paragraph, you have noted that the parents have used the transitional expressions like but, rather than, conversely, to talk about contrast, to talk about the differences between the two kids. Now we move on to the other type or the other technique that we use in comparison and contrast writing in academic writing. The other technique is called the block structure. As we've already discussed, that in the block structure, the writer talks about one object in detail and then moves on to describe in detail the next object. But there is something that you need to keep in mind, and that is that while the writer is using two different paragraphs or maybe the two different parts of the same paragraph to describe the two different objects, there are certain points of comparison that are there. If the writer is talking about certain thing or certain characteristic of one object, it is the same characteristic of the other object that he'll be talking in the next part of the paragraph. To make it more clear to you, I have certain examples for you to look at. There is this paragraph on your screen which says, so Grant and Lee were in complete contrast, representing two diametrically opposed elements in American life. Grant was the modern age emerging. Beyond him, ready to come on the stage, was the great age of steel and machinery, of crowded cities, and a restlessly burgeoning vitality. Lee might have ridden down from the old age of chivalry, lance in hand, silken banner fluttering over his head. Each man was the perfect champion of his cause, drawing both his strengths and weaknesses from the people he led. Now, this paragraph is a good example of block structure of paragraph organization for contrast or comparison. If you look at the paragraph closely, you see that the writer discusses Grant and Lee in the first sentence. Dear students, this is important to note here that the first sentence of this paragraph here serves as a topic sentence. Recall to your mind Unit 1, where we talked about what a topic sentence of a paragraph is. And the topic sentence is a sentence that carries the whole meaning of that paragraph. Look back at the same paragraph that we've just read. The first sentence of this paragraph is the topic sentence where the writer tells you that Grant and Lee are two people who have very contrasting lives, and both of them represent two opposed elements in American life. Using the block structure of comparison and contrast writing, the writer first gives some space to the way Grant lives, and then the last part of the paragraph he dedicates to how Lee believes in living his life. And at the end, he kind of summarizes or concludes. So this takes you back to the structure of academic writing. This talks about the fact how is it that in academic writing, the writer has a proper introduction, the topic sentence, even inside a paragraph. He has an introduction, he has a body where he compares and contrasts Grant and Lee, and then he has a conclusion where he talks about both of them and he kind of sums up the contrasting elements in the lives of both the characters, Grant and Lee. I have another example for you that speaks about the block structure of writing in comparison and contrast. Games are of limited duration, take place on or in fixed and finite sites, and are governed by openly promulgated rules that are enforced on the spot by neutral professionals. Moreover, they are performed by relatively evenly matched teams that are counseled and led through every move by seasoned hands. Scores are kept, and at the end of the game, a winner is declared. Business is usually a little different. In fact, if there is anyone out there who can say that the business is of limited duration, takes place on a fixed site, is governed by openly promulgated rules that are enforced on the spot by neutral professionals, competes only on relatively even terms, and performs in a way that can be measured in runs or points, then that person is either extraordinarily lucky or seriously deluded. If you look at this paragraph closely, you see that the writer is comparing games and business. Now you see that he has used the block structure of comparison and contrast writing. And how do you see that? You can see by the highlighted games and business. The first part of the paragraph is dedicated to games, and the second part of the paragraph is dedicated to business. But students, one thing that you need to really keep in mind is that it isn't that the writer writes two independent parts of a paragraph on games and business. Rather, the two paragraphs are connected by certain terms of comparison. They talk about the sites of the games and business. They talk about the mode, or you can say the role of professionals in games and business. They talk about the team. They talk about the season hands. So there are certain terms of comparison that have been used to compare games and business. So you need to keep in mind, while doing such writing of comparison and contrast in block structure, that though the writer may dedicate, or you as a writer may dedicate one of the part of the paragraph to one item and the other part of the paragraph to other item, there must be some similar terms of comparison. It isn't that you write on one structure or one object or one phenomenon independently of what are the other terms of comparison that you're using about the other object or phenomena or structure. So this is how the comparison and contrast writing is done. Now, as promised, I'm going to give you a whole list of transitional expressions that will be helpful for you if you look at them and keep them in your mind and remember them. It would be good for you, and they'll be helpful for you to write comparison and contrast paragraphs. On the screen, you can have this list. For comparing, you can use the terms like alike, along the same lines, also, as well as, in the same way, by the same token, in comparison to, in the same manner, to, similarly, likewise, like, is similar to, compared to, and both. For contrasting, you have a separate list that includes but, by contrast, contrasted with, contrasting, conversely, however, in contrast, in spite of, nevertheless, while, yet, whether or not, unlike, rather than, on the other hand, on the contrary, and nonetheless. This list is going to help you to write while you are either comparing two objects for similarity, or you are contrasting the two objects for differences. Now we come to the end of today's unit. We have seen that in today's unit, we have seen how to talk about or how to write about comparison and contrast for academic purposes. Keep in mind that while we compare, we are not only writing about similarities, though comparison normally is about writing down about similarities, but it can also include differences. On the other hand, contrast is mainly or usually or only about the differences between two objects. You have to keep in mind this list, the given list of transitional expressions, along with many other that can be used to write a comparison and contrast paragraph or a piece of writing. Dear students, you are given two techniques of writing for comparison and contrast. There is point-by-point structure and there is block structure that we have discussed along with examples. Just keep in mind that whenever you are comparing and contrasting, you have certain you should have certain points of comparison in your mind. If you're comparing two human beings, let's say, to make it more easy for you, if I compare myself with another person, there must be some points of comparison. I just can't write a paragraph on myself and then another on that person and can't say it's comparison and contrast. What is important is that I take certain points of comparison. For example, if I'm writing or comparing or contrasting myself with another person, then I'll have certain points of comparison. Let's see, I say I compare or contrast myself with this person on the basis of height, qualification, job description, professional experience. Now I've joined two features, one physical feature, height, and three qualification, and then there are professional experiences. So only on these points of comparison I'll be comparing myself with that other person. I can do this either by point structure or by using block structure. If I use point structure, I'll say that my height is this while this other person's height is this. I have studied this while this other person has studied this, and so on and so forth. If I'm using the block structure, I'll write a few lines on myself only talking about the 4 terms of comparison that we've already fixed, that is height, qualification, job description, and professional experience. So I'll write about these 4 things for myself, and then the rest of the part of the paragraph or the part of the of academic writing will be dedicated to all these 4 terms or all these 4 points in that other person. So this is how you do comparison and contrast writing in English for academic purposes. Thank you very much.